Hey folks, welcome to another episode of ASP.NET Core from Zero to Overkill. In this episode we'll talk about moving the current MVC application into a web API that we can in the future consume from a single page application and other services. But before getting into the code, I have some notes to leave here. So this is a re-recording of this episode. I already released episode 12, but I messed up with the scaling, so the font is really small. On the previous episodes, the font wasn't already great, but in episode 12 it is particularly bad. So I'm re-recording this one, and in the future I'll make sure I have the scaling correct. So right now I'm using 225% scaling at OS level. Before I was at 150 and didn't zoom in or anything, so hence the problems. Episodes 13, 14 and 15 are already recorded, and 13 is already published, so those were recorded at 200%. Hopefully that's not that bad, but they're already recorded, so I hope I don't have to re-record them, although I doubt it. So these are the initial notes, and some other note is that with some feedback on the videos, which is great, gave me some ideas so to improve the future videos, and this overview is one of those ideas. So yeah, I will share more about this in the future probably, but right now I wanted mostly to talk about these scaling issues that happened before. So from now on, hopefully everyone will be able to see the code correctly. Moving on to the interesting part. So I have a couple of steps here. So what we will be doing in this episode. So we'll be moving from the application that we have right now to a web API, and we have some steps. So we'll remove the views, we'll make a change to the controller to inherit from controller base instead of controller. We'll see why in a moment. We'll make use of a newish attribute, which is API controller, that avoids us some manual work. We will also see this. We'll be replacing add MVC with MVC core in the startup class. Make a fix that I noticed that is wrong on the migrations. So to change the type of the ID column. Also on updates we'll override the ID that's passed on by the client of the API. We'll be removing the not found that exists right now on the application, but given the way we are handling updates on Entity Framework, this isn't really useful right now. We'll see it in a bit. We'll also take advantage of exception filters to handle concurrency issues that we've seen in the previous episode. And we'll add a delete endpoint, as right now we don't have the ability to delete groups. So let's get to code, and just a reminder, please provide any feedback, because like you see, I listen to it and I try to adapt and improve. So be sure to leave some feedback. Now let's get to code. Starting with the easy parts, which are deleting stuff. So we don't need the views anymore because we are moving away from MVC. If we go back to controller, so the views are gone. Now we need to adapt this to be an API. So like I mentioned, we are moving from controller to controller base, because basically controller adds the functionality for views, and controller base doesn't have that functionality. and we don't need it because we don't have views anymore, so no need for this. And let me just show you something here. The goal of the API is to end up with these endpoints. So I want an endpoint. We use the HTTP GET to get all groups, a get by ID, which is a get with the ID. We will be using post or put directly to groups to add a group. Just put with the ID on the route will update an existing entity, and the delete with the ID, of course, on the route, on the groups route, will remove an existing group. So let's see here how we achieve that. So this is the get all. So let's change the name to all async, and we'll return okay with the result. So the view was providing a way to get that view model to the view for rendering. Because now we don't have views, we can use things like this OK object, which will provide a 200 response, and with the payload that we provide here. So it will be serialized to JSON. We could add other formatters and respond in XML or stuff like that if we wanted, but we'll stick with JSON. One thing I was forgetting is to change this, because these aren't really view models anymore, because we have no views. So let's just rename these to models. Okay, so this will output the 200 with the array of groups. Now over here, it's what I was talking about. This not found is really not needed because... Oh, sorry, this is needed because this is the details. Wrong. So get by ID, and we'll do exactly the same here. Returning a 200. We could, instead of doing it like this, we could return group model directly, and then we could just do this. But in this case we couldn't do this, because to return, for instance, this not found, it is required for it to return an iAction result, at least to use these helpers. Otherwise we would need to do this by hand, probably, unless there is another way I don't know about. But you could also go to response dot status code, and we could put a 400 in here, but it isn't the best. So that's why I'm returning an iAction result, so we can use these helper methods correctly, as we were doing with the views, which also took advantage of this. Now get by ID, edit async is basically update. We will be removing this anti-forgery token for now, because being an API, it will work in a different way we'll be adding this in the future, but right now we'll just remove it. So on update, this was the one I was talking about. This will never happen because the way we are implementing this in EF core, if the entity doesn't exist, it will throw an error because of concurrency, because it can't find the entity. So we can delete this. And in the update, instead of this redirect, we can return the OK, or we can return the OK. Yes, it's probably the best. So group dot to model. Now in the create we don't need this. This was only used to get the page for the creation, and like before, this will go. I was forgetting the HTTP. So this will update a complete entity. So it's a put. We'll use a post and also a put for adding entities. So although they are both put, the routes are different. So it will only be an update when the ID is provided. When the ID is not provided, it will be a create. And we can change the name to add. We'll get this and we'll return. I don't want an OK, I want another status code that I can't remember right now. 201 created. Yes. Created that. Action, exactly. So we want to return a 201. If that will take the name of the action, which is get by ID async. And needs a value, so a route value. So by doing this, we say that we need to go to the route to this get by ID with this ID, and we'll provide the actual value, so it's not needed to make another request. The client can get what's coming from this response and work immediately. So this should make the API work for now. Let's make a quick test to see what we get. So let's make it run for starters. Okay, so now let's go here. If you make this request, we get an empty array because we haven't added anything. If we put an ID that doesn't exist, we get 404, also nice. Now let's try to add something. Body, raw, JSON. So the only thing we need here in the group model is the name. Let's try it. And we got 200 with an array. That was unexpected. Oh, of course. What about now? Okay, so it created, but if you notice, there's no name here. That's because model binding is not working correctly by default. So it isn't reading this correctly. We can do one thing to fix this, which is from body. Let me .NET watch run. Now let's try again. Now it worked. So by default, the model binding doesn't know that this comes from the body, and so we need to put it explicitly. But then we need to put it explicitly here and in other places. So instead of doing this, we can use something, I think, recent, which is API controller. What this does is enforce some conventions, some defaults, and because of these conventions, it will assume that, for instance, these kinds of types will come from the route or from the query string, but then these complex types will come from the body, unless we go here and put from query, which is not the case. Right now I'm not sure if this will work at the first. I think not, but let's check it out. So I removed this from here. Let's go. This restarted. Let's try again. Yet another group. And we get an error, which isn't great. It's one of those developer errors. But the problem is to use this API controller, if I'm not mistaken. We need something that I had here but didn't really talk about, which is using set compatibility version. We need to use this on MVC. So let me just copy this and show you. Over here on startup, we can do this. Basically, to avoid breaking changes, they use this. So if someone migrates from ASP.NET Core 2.0 to 2.1 to 2.2, because they are not major versions, they want to keep compatibility, and that implies the inner workings of MVC staying the same, or at least behaving the same from the outside perspective. So things like that apparently don't work correctly. I think we can see here the error is that okay, lost the error, but oh, exactly. Well, this way it was assuming, looking at the controller, that it had two objects that came from the body, the model and the cancellation token, which isn't the case. So let's just try something just for demo's sake. If we go here, I comment this out, and let's try this again. Okay. Okay. So I was wrong, that was not a problem. More than one parameter that was specified or inferred may be bound to the body. Okay, now I'm lost because there's only one argument there. Cancellation token. Yes, but I removed the cancellation token. Oh, idiot. It's talking about the update async. What about now? Now it worked. Okay. So that was a problem. The way like this, without putting here the compatibility version, this works and infers, with this infers that it's from body, but doesn't know that the cancellation token is not from body but is injected by the framework. So let's revert this. Let's go here and let's put this because we want the cancellation token. So this is the article I was reading before, which is talking about exactly this. So to avoid breaking changes on minor versions, the behavior from a outside perspective remains the same. If we want to have the new behavior, we use this compatibility version. So we are explicitly telling the framework that we want the new behavior. So now if I go back here, come on Postman, help me out. Okay, so now it's working how I want it to. We can do one last thing to avoid doing this everywhere. We can go to the startup, and I don't remember how's the way. Control. Okay, this is what I want. So by doing this, instead of having to put this attribute in every controller, it will apply automatically to all controllers in the assembly. So we don't need to worry about it anymore. But you can see here in the docs that talks about this API controller. So things like this, produces something, produces type 400. All of this is considered convention, and by doing this, we don't need to do all of that anymore. And they'll talk about this compatibility version. So this is for the convention part. This produces and stuff like that. I think it's used for now I can't remember the name, Swagger, to tell to generate the documentation and stuff like that. For instance, it's not needed to do model state is valid. We haven't talked about validation yet, but we don't need to do this because it's done automatically when we use this API controller. So the usual stuff that we do by using the API controller are done automatically. Then anything extra we must add as usual. So okay, we have this part how we want it for now. Let me get back to the steps to check out. So we remove the views, we change this controller base to controller, or vice versa. We're using API controller to enforce some conventions, and now let's replace MVC with MVC core. I think I talked about this in the past episode, but like we saw, MVC brings everything, and we probably don't need it because let's check what's coming with MVC. So this is MVC, which calls something called MVC core, then adds a bunch of parts: API Explorer, authorization, default framework parts, apart from views and stuff like that, and we don't need most of this. Maybe we'll need in the future, but we can add later. So this part you probably don't need to worry about. We can just use MVC, but I just wanted to bring out that if we want to make the application like a little bit lighter, we can bypass MVC, use MVC core, and then just add what we need. So let's try that. We'll go here to our service collection extensions, and we'll add let me just check. Like I said in the beginning, this is a re-recording, so let me just check how I call this exactly, just so the code ends up as possible, as close as possible. So over here, starter, let's go here to the startup and replace this with this, and let's copy this out. More MVC builder, it's what this returns. Okay, this is what we have. So let's replace MVC with MVC core. Need to return services. So this returns a MVC core builder, so MVC builder. And now, if we just go with this, it will probably won't work, but let's try. So we got a 406 because yeah, we don't have all the parts that are needed for this to work. So let's go here to the MVC implementation. We'll copy this, and we'll delete what we don't need. So add API Explorer. Right now, no need. This is probably some Swagger stuff. We will only see this in the future. Authorization, we'll also need it in the future, but we don't have right now. We can delete. Add default framework parts. Let's see what this is. framework parts, application parts, MVC tag helpers, Razor assembly. Right now we don't need, maybe in the future it will blow up on our faces, but so all of this seems to be views and stuff. Data notations, we aren't needing it yet. JSON formatters, this we need for sure. Cores, sorry, we don't need it for now. Don't need to enable cross-origin requests. So, if I'm not mistaken, all we need right now is JSON formats, the core, MVC, JSON formatters, and setting the compatibility version. So let's see this here. Apparently it's already up and running, and we got this. So let's go here. Let's change this to put. The name, some group. Okay, let's go back to the list. The list. Okay, here's the list. So this is fixed. Let's check out this put body. This is the previous version. So if we send this request right now, we should get an error. And it's not a great error because it's throwing an exception, database operation except, so the DB update concurrency, which is what we expected. So right now, getting back to the notes, we have this. So we need to use the exception filter. I'm not going in order because I go as I remember, so sorry about that. But now let's create an exception filter to handle this concurrent updates instead of getting this error that's not really processable by a client. So let's create here a new folder. And that which implements exception filter. So like we saw in the past episode about filters, because we have an error like this and we don't want to, on every operation of the controller, in this case on the update or in the update, but in every update of every controller we don't want to worry about this, so we would need to do like a try catch db update exception. We would need to do this in every place and then handle the error. So we could return a nice status code. We don't want to do this, so we create a filter. And over here we can just go if context dot exception is db update exception. Oh, it's not update, let me check. Update concurrency exception. One of these, which we should probably don't use because this ties us to entity framework core, and if we changed it, this wouldn't be the best exception. So we should have like a concurrent exception on the service side, on the business part, but right now this will work. And then we can do context.result equals conflict. Does it exist? It does. So it's a 409. Or not. Message. Do we have? We don't have. Only this conflict result. (409) conflict object result 409. Okay, I think that's what we want. New message. And the entity was updated. Please refresh. Your copy. Okay, so we have the exception. Now we need to register it, so we can go to the service collection extensions here. And let me check the overload. So MVC options. Filters. We have the filter and we need to add it. Add transient. We need to add it to the services as well so it can be resolved. By registering here, like we've seen in the episode about filters, this will be a filter for every controller, not just one specific. So anytime that kind of exception occurs, it will be handled by the filter. So let's see if it's working. So exactly the same, send, seems nice. So we get a 409 with the entity updated. So let's get back to the episode notes and see what we need to do next. Okay, so we need to fix the ID column that I used the wrong type. So let's go here to the data part, group entity configuration, and instead of using this use npg, the problem is, let me show you just for you to know why I want to change this. If I, for instance, add a new one, And let's say I put the value here, like 100. So it inserted with a value, and we don't want that. We want always a generated value. So if we go here, get, and here's here with the ID, we don't want that. There are multiple things we can do, but one of those is, instead of use npg serial column, which I should have used use identity always column. So let me stop this here because we need to do a migration. So, but I think it's rather obvious. Instead of just being a serial value, it will be an identity always. There's also a default by default, but this also allows us to override. We want always, so it's not overrideable. It must always be generated by the database. So let's create a migration for this. So .NET EF migration add make ID column all identity always. And I need to pass the startup project, but I don't remember the argument. So the argument is startup project. Argument migration, really? So it's migrations. Bingo. So let's go back to the application. And so the migration should be applied. And now if we test again, body let's put 200. And we get an exception, which isn't pretty, but oh well. So Postgres exception cannot insert into column ID. Exactly what we wanted. So now we can't run it. Now we can do just one thing, just to be sure, which is over here, for instance, on add, we can do model.id equals 0. Or, and in the update, here's another point that I have in the notes, which is model.id should be equal to id. This should match. So there are probably other ways to approach this. Maybe I should throw an error, but in fact this model ID doesn't even matter. So in the future we'll handle that with using different models for different operations, but for now, because we are doing it this way, I'll just override the IDs. So on add, it doesn't it shouldn't have anything, and on update it should have the same that is on the route. So let's get back here to the get, fetch everything. Now we have this. Now let's add, I think it's the last point for the day. Done, 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 done. Let's add a delete endpoint to the API. So let's get back here. Let's add a public async task action result. And we want await service dot. Oh, it's missing the remove. Let's go to the service. It will be a task that returns nothing because we don't want any info other than it succeeded, and we want the ID. So to do this, let's make async. One would say that we could do something like this update. We could do something like context dot var group entity equals new group. Where the ID equals ID. Then we could do context dot entry group entity dot state equals deleted. And then we could save changes. This, I'm pretty sure, would work if we didn't have the concurrency token. Because we have the concurrency token, when it does this, it outputs an error because the row version is not the same as in the database. So because of this, we can't do it this way. We need to do it the slower way, which is fetch it tt to remove equals. So we need basically this, but we need it with tracking, and then we can do context dot oops, remove. So we need to fetch it first and then delete it. We could also avoid this by the front end sending the row version, but don't know, doesn't seem the usual thing to do. Normally the ID should be enough to delete it, but maybe we could think in the future if it makes sense or not to send also the row version. But now let's leave it like this and head back to the controller. And now wait group service dot remove ID cancellation token, and then we can return no content. The route is this one, we need the ID, and it's an HTTP delete. So we want to delete this 100. That's not great. So 100 delete, send, method not allowed. How come method not allowed? Delete on group / 100. Seems good to me. What am I doing wrong here? No idea. Let me just restart this. I think I just noticed the problem. It was on .NET Run instead of .NET Watch Run. So when I changed the delete, it didn't do anything. So right now it should work. Yay! As usual, computer's right. So let's make one of these. No. Okay, and we deleted 100. Okay, let me look at the notes, but I think that's it. Yep. So this is it for this episode, or the redo of this episode. Hopefully it turns out better than the first attempt, particularly on the font size. And yeah, like I said, the feedback was very important to make this improvement. So let me know if you have suggestions to improve the videos going forward. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again in the next one. See yous!